Greetings, everybody. Hello, and welcome to Chilliteracy. Happy Thursday. I was about to say Wednesday. Wow, that is full on ingrained in my brain. Happy Thursday. Mwahahaha. I have decided to move the stream to today because I was busy yesterday and we still have a lot of book to get through. So I thought, why not put it on a Thursday? Thursday, exactly. Woden's Day is Wednesday, but Woden's Thursday is Thursday. There you go. I believe that's where Wednesday comes from. Woden's Day, I think. People can correct me. I feel like there's going to be a few people in chat who probably know. But yes, hello everybody. How are we all doing? I hope we are well. I hope we are... Oh, excuse me. Oh. It is. Also, hi Andy. Greetings. We have lots of people who are, I assume, double streaming with this, which will be significantly more chill than Farming Sim, where two, I was going to say grown men, debating on whether mentally are drawing rude things in fields. Actually, I think it was just Sam, wasn't it? But yes, we are much more ecclesiastical here for this particular book, so we're being much more polite. None of that filth over here. But yes, hello everybody. Hello, Lady Muffstoffleys. Thank you very much for the resub. 28 months. That's almost a year. Small cog, greet. Why am I saying greet today? I don't know, it's just a thing. Oh yeah, I forgot to pin the text, didn't I? Let's do that. But greetings. Arian, hello. Llama. Bonjour. Who else we got? Lynn, hello. Parola, hello. Queek, also hello. And Andy, hello. Grown men, children. That's the one. You've abandoned the farmers for book and puzzles? That sounds like an excellent idea. both grown and men in thingies. Oh boy, can you multi-Twitch? You can multi-stream 3 different streams? I didn't realise you could do that. I thought it was just 2. Good lord. Oh god. This is oh god. Oh, excuse me. And the yawning has begun. But yes, hello everybody. I hope we are doing well. Ultimate ADHD test. Yeah, god. Yeah. Oh boy. This is going to go well. Well, I shan't be multi-streaming for I must read. But yes, how has everybody's weeks been, given that we are slightly further through the week than we are usually? You haven't hit a limit yet. You think you've done 6? Blimey. Surely that's a nightmare to fit on screen. Oh, I suppose, and if it does the shared chat, then I suppose that's a bit easier. But yeah, that must take up a lot of, screen space. But yes, hope everybody's weeks are going well. I have eaten my body weight in Indian food today. It's been great. Anybody who has ever been to Dishoom, either in, I believe it's in Manchester / Birmingham, I think possibly 2 other places, and London, numerous places, you'll know why I've eaten my body weight in that incredible food. Anybody who hasn't been to Dishoom, go to Dishoom. When you're in the UK, it's a chain. It's a chain of Indian restaurants, specifically Bombay restaurants, and the food is incredible. Annoyingly, I think they're only in London, Manchester, and I think possibly Birmingham. I want to say Birmingham, I think. Very annoyingly not in Bristol, which is frankly rude of them. But there are like 4 of them in London, I think. And any vegan-friendly food, So there's a lot of good veggie options, and also I think they do a full vegan menu as well. But yeah, it's just a very good place. And the menu is enormous, and you sort of want to eat everything on it, and then you choose several thousand things, and then you realise that you can't finish any of them. But they're really good. Specifically, recommendation, their gunpowder potatoes, which are like potatoes with, I think, like coriander, lime, probably some other spices, and you dip them in like a sort of writer type thing, and oh my god, so good. They are very Moorish and very limey. I'm always a fan of the lime and everything, but yeah, it's really good. Went to an Indian restaurant in cannelloni there. Ah yes, cannelloni, that Indian staple. You're having dinner on baked root veg and stuff. Nice. You're too full to sleep now. Oh dear, Arian. And you have eaten a bowl of cereal today? Well, I hope it was a good bowl of cereal. And Queek has eaten your weight in Italian food. Nice. Also good. But yeah, it's just, it's such a good place. And also they do incredible chai. And their lassies are really good as well. When I say lassies, I mean as in Lassi. I realise I'm sounding like I'm saying, oh, the girls, they're great. No. And a massive bar burger dinner. Ooh, nice. Excellent. Yeah. My voice is apparently croaky. This is entertaining. Puzzle, yeah. Puzzle away. A good friend of mine has recently been working her way through, I think, like 5, not at once, of those, what are they called? Is it Wozage? Wozage? Jigsaw spelled backwards. The jigsaw puzzles that are, that the picture on the back is what the reverse of the puzzle is, basically. So for example, if that's the one. I don't actually know how you're meant to pronounce it. Wozgij, I guess. But yeah, like the picture you're trying to create is what the people in the picture on the box are seeing. So very differently if it was Dutch or Belgian. Oh, nice. Okay. Silly languages. But yeah, and turns out that's really quite difficult. It's a really fun concept though, but it just adds an extra layer of difficulty to an already difficult puzzle. I think they're always 1,000-piece puzzles as well. So they do have some very fun puzzles. Yeah, I did a Pride Parade one with her. And she sort of gave up after about 5 minutes, and then was trying to drag me away from the table to go for dinner. And I was just like, yeah, but I've just seen a piece. Me and jigsaws, I get into a very focused mindset. I just don't speak for like 4 hours. You've also seen some that show a moment in time and the puzzle is a bit later in time. Oh, that's cool as well. I like that. Yeah, I really like that concept. So, yeah, fun. It's so hard to leave a jigsaw. I know, it's that classic sort of like, oh, just one more piece, or you just spot something. And oh, I know where that goes. And it's just, it's dangerous. It's very dangerous. I'm not someone who gets, excuse me. I'm not someone who gets sort of addicted to things easily, but jigsaws, it's just so satisfying. They really are. Not great for your back, though. I tend to do jigsaws on the floor, which means you're sort of leaning... Well, actually, no, even on a table, you're sort of leaning over. It's not the best for your neck and back, I guess. But, they are mentally stimulating and good for the old brain, I imagine. Oh, I've put the bookmarks away. Let me get my bookmarks out. There we go. Tiddly tiddly pomp. Your grandma has a lot of them. Nice. I feel like everybody's grandma should have jigsaws. You definitely haven't stayed up till 4 a.m. because you had to finish a difficult one online. I think I've probably done something similar, to be honest. You're not alone. Fear not. Right. I'm just gonna put a bookmark in. Tiddly tiddly. Why am I... What? Sorry, my brain is just in so many places at the moment. I have so many things to be thinking of. Yeah, I'll see how oops, punch the microphone. I'll see how my voice holds up tonight, because I've been doing a lot of talking this week, so it might get a little croaky after a while. So yes, we shall see how that goes. But yeah, what has happened so far in Barchester Towers? I don't know why I'm saying it like that. We had a very fun fun introduction to a new set of characters last time, which was the... Is it Stanhope family? Yes. Yes. It's the Stanhopes, who are, fun. The youngest daughter of which is disabled, but is not letting that stop her in any possible way. And they've all been living in Italy, and they have returned to Barchester for on the invitation of the new bishop / Mr. Slope. And the new bishop has hosted a party, and oh God, what's her name? What's her name? What is her name? My brain's gone. It's not Charlotte. Charlotte's the other one. Oh, flippin' heck. Can't remember her name. Anyway, she, younger sister, she always maintains that she must have a sofa wherever she is going. So she is carried to the sofa, and basically everybody's turned up at this party apart from her. And everybody's been, oh, why is that sofa empty? Who's going to be sitting there? And there's always, no, you must not sit on that sofa. It is being reserved one person. And then, of course, she makes a grand entrance, and is draped very neatly and very prettily on the sofa. And now she's just like commanding the entire party. She was fashionably late, and absolutely nailed the entrance. So methinks she's going to be a player here in the general story, which we love. So I'm intrigued to see how this goes. You're surprised you did not bring coffee, yes. Just like a little flask. It's just like, I shall have my own coffee, thank you. But yes, she is absolutely going to rule the place. I hope so. She sounds fun. But yeah, if we are all sitting comfortably, have, some kind of beverage or cat, excuse me, or whatever, or blanket, because certainly in the UK it's got cold again. Beautiful week last week, and then this week it's been, it's winter again. But yes, we shall continue with Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 11. Before I continue, I have been corrected. This is by my parents, because they have both read this. It's Proudy, not Prudy. So I shall henceforth be calling them the Proudies. Whoopsie. I assume that name is intentional. Anyway, we shall continue, sorry. Chapter 11. Mrs. Proudy's reception. Continued. Bishop of Barchester, I presume? Said Bertie Stanhope, putting out his hand frankly. I am delighted to make your acquaintance. We are in rather close quarters here, aren't we? In truth, they were. They had been crowded up behind the head of the sofa, the bishop in waiting to receive his guest, and the other in carrying her, and now they had hardly room to move themselves. The bishop gave his hand quickly, and made his little studied bow, and was delighted to make... He couldn't go on, for he did not know whether his friend was a signor, or a court, or a count, I think, or a prince. My sister really puts you all to great trouble, said Bertie. Not at all. The bishop was delighted to have the opportunity of welcoming the Signora Vichironi, so at least he said, and attempted to force his way round to the front of the sofa. He had, at any rate, learned that his strange guests were brother and sister. The man, he presumed, must be Signor Vichironi, or count or prince as it might be. It was wonderful what good English he spoke. There was just a twang of a foreign accent, and no more. Do you like Barchester on the whole? Asked Bertie. The bishop, looking dignified, said that he did like Barchester. You've not been here very long, I believe, said Bertie. No, not long, said the bishop, and tried again to make his way between the back of the sofa and a heavy rector, who was staring over it at the grimaces of the signora. "You weren't a bishop before, were you?" Dr. Proudie explained that this was the first diocese he had held. "Ah, I thought so," said Bertie. "But you are changed about sometimes, aren't you?" "Translations are occasionally made," said Dr. Proudie, "but not so frequently as in former days." "They've cut them all down to pretty nearly the same figure, haven't they?" said Bertie. To this the bishop could not bring himself to make any answer, but again attempted to move the rector. "But the work, I suppose, is different," continued Bertie. "Is there much to do here at Barchester?" This was said exactly in the tone that a young Admiralty clerk might use in asking the same question of a brother acolyte of the Treasury. "The work of a bishop of the Church of England," said Dr. Proudie with considerable dignity, "is not easy. The responsibility which he has to bear is very great indeed." "Is it?" said Bertie, opening wide his wonderful blue eyes. "Well, I never was afraid of responsibility. I once had thoughts of being a bishop myself." "Had thoughts of being a bishop?" said Dr. Proudie, much amazed. "That is, a parson. A parson first, you know, and a bishop afterwards. If I had once begun, I'd have stuck to it. But on the whole, I like the Church of Rome the best." The bishop could not discuss the point, so he remained silent. "Now, there's my father," continued Bertie. "He hasn't stuck to it. I fancy he didn't like saying the same thing over so often. By the by, Bishop, have you seen my father?" The bishop was more amazed than ever. Had he seen his father? "No," he replied. He had not yet had the pleasure. He hoped he might. And as he said so, he resolved to bear heavy on that fat, immovable rector, if ever he had the power of doing so. "He's in the room somewhere," said Bertie, "and he'll turn up soon. By the by, do you know much about the Jews?" At last the bishop saw a way out. "I beg your pardon," said he, "but I'm forced to go round the room." "Well, I believe I'll follow in your wake," said Bertie. "Terribly hot, isn't it?" This he addressed to the fat rector with whom he had brought himself into the closest contact. "They've got this sofa into the worst possible part of the room. Suppose we move it. Take care, Madeline." The sofa had certainly been so placed that those who were behind it found great difficulty in getting out. There was but a narrow gangway, which one person could stop. This was a bad arrangement, and one which Bertie thought it might be well to improve. "Take care, Madeline," said he, and turning to the fat rector added, "Just help me with a slight push." The rector's weight was resting on the sofa, and unwittingly lent all its impetus to accelerate and increase the motion which Bertie intentionally originated. The sofa rushed from its moorings and ran half-way into the middle of the room. Mrs. Proudie was standing with Mr. Slope in front of the signora, and had been trying to be condescending and sociable, but she was not in the very best of tempers, for she found that whenever she spoke to the lady replied by speaking to Mr. Slope. Mr. Slope was a favourite, no doubt, but Mrs. Proudie had no idea of being less thought of than the chaplain. She was beginning to be stately, stiff and offended, when unfortunately the caster of the sofa caught itself in her lace train, and carried away there is no saying how much of her garniture. Gathers were heard to go, stitches to crack, plaits to fly open, flounces were seen to fall, and breadths to expose themselves. A long ruin of rent lace disfigured the carpet, and still clung to the vile wheel on which the sofa moved. So, when a granite battery is raised, excellent to the eyes of wayfaring men, is its strength and symmetry admired. It is the work of years. Its neat embrasures, its finished parapets, its casemented stories show all the skill of modern science. But anon a small spark is applied to the treacherous fuse, a cloud of dust arises to the heavens, and then nothing is to be seen but dirt and dust and ugly fragments. We know what was the wrath of Juno when her beauty was despised. We know too what storms of passion even celestial minds can yield. As Juno may have looked at Paris on Mount Ida, so did Mrs. Proudie look on Ethelbert Stanhope when he pushed the leg of the sofa into her lace train. "Oh, you idiot, Bertie," said the Signora, seeing what had been done, and what were to be the consequences. "Idiot!" re-echoed Mrs. Proudie, as though the word were not half strong enough to express the required meaning. "I'll let him know—" And then, looking round to learn at a glance the worst, she saw that at present it behoved her to collect the scattered debris of her dress. Bertie, when he saw what he had done, rushed over the sofa and threw himself on one knee before the offended lady. His object, doubtless, was to liberate the torn lace from the caster, but he looked as though he were imploring pardon from a goddess. "Unhand it, sir," said Mrs. Proudie. From what scrap of dramatic poetry she had extracted the word cannot be said, but it must have rested on her memory, and now seemed opportunely dignified for the occasion. "I'll fly to the looms of the fairies to repair the damage, if only you'll forgive me," said Ethelbert, still on his knees. "Unhand it, sir," said Mrs. Proudie, with redoubled emphasis, and all but furious wrath. This allusion to the fairies was a direct mockery, and intended to turn her into ridicule. So at least it seemed to her. "Unhand it, sir!" she almost screamed. "It's not me, it's the cursed sofa," said Bertie, looking imploringly in her face and holding up both his hands to show that he was not touching her belongings, but still remaining on his knees. Hereupon the Signora laughed, not loud indeed, but yet audibly. And as the tigress bereft of her young will turn with equal anger on any within reach, so did Mrs. Proudie turn upon her female guest. "Madam," she said, and it is beyond the power of prose to tell of the fire which flashed from her eyes. The Signora stared her full in the face for a moment, and then turning to her brother said playfully, "Bertie, you idiot, get up." By this time the bishop and Mr. Slope and her 3 daughters were around her, and had collected together the wide ruins of her magnificence. The girls fell into circular rank behind their mother, and thus following her and carrying out the fragments, they left the reception rooms in a manner not altogether devoid of dignity. Mrs. Proudie had to retire and re-array herself. As soon as the constellation had swept by, Ethelbert rose from his knees, and turning with mock anger to the fat rector, said, "After all, it was your doing, sir, not mine. But perhaps you were waiting for preferment, and so I bore it." Whereupon there was a laugh against the fat rector, in which both the bishop and the chaplain joined, and thus things got themselves again into order. "Oh, my lord, I am so sorry for this accident," said the Signora, putting out her hand so as to force the bishop to take it. "My brother is so thoughtless. Pray sit down, and let me have the pleasure of making your acquaintance. Though I am so poor a creature as to want a sofa, I am not so selfish as to require it all." Madeline could always dispose herself so as to make room for a gentleman, though, as she declared, the crinoline of her lady friends was much too bulky to be so accommodated. "It was solely for the pleasure of meeting you that I have had myself dragged here," she continued.
Of course, with your occupation, one cannot even hope that you should have time to come to us, that is, in the way of calling. And at your English dinner parties all is so dull and so stately. Do you know, my lord, that in coming to England my only consolation has been the thought that I should know you?" And she looked at him with the look of a she-devil. The bishop, however, thought that she looked very like an angel, and accepting the proffered seat, sat down beside her. He uttered some platitude as to his deep obligation for the trouble she had taken, and wondered more and more who she was. "Of course you know my sad story?" she continued. The bishop didn't know a word of it. He knew, however, or thought he knew, that she couldn't walk into a room like other people, and so made the most of that. He put on a look of ineffable distress, and said that he was aware how God had afflicted her. The signora just touched the corner of her eyes with the most lovely of pocket-handkerchiefs. Yes, she said, she had been sorely tried. Tried, she thought, beyond the common endurance of humanity. But while her child was left to her, everything was left. "Oh, my lord," she exclaimed, "you must see that infant, the last bud of a wondrous tree. You must let a mother hope that you will lay your holy hands on her innocent head and consecrate her for female virtues. May I hope it?" said she, looking into the bishop's eye and touching the bishop's arm with her hand. The bishop was but a man, and said she might. After all, what was it but a request that he would confirm her daughter? A request indeed very unnecessary to make, as he should do so as a matter of course, if the young lady came forward in the usual way. "The blood of Tiberius," said the signora in all but a whisper. "The blood of Tiberius flows in her veins. She is the last of the Neros." The bishop had heard of the last of the Visigoths, and had floating in his brain some indistinct idea of the last of the Mohicans, but to have the last of the Neros thus brought before him for a blessing was very staggering. Still, he liked the lady. She had a proper way of thinking, and talked with more propriety than her brother. But who were they? It was now quite clear that that blue madman with the silky beard was not a Prince Viceroni. The lady was married, and was of course one of the Viceronis by right of the husband. So the bishop went on learning. "When will you see her?" said the signora with a start. "See whom?" said the bishop. "My child," said the mother. "What is the young lady's age?" asked the bishop. "She is just 7, said the signora. "Oh," said the bishop, shaking his head, "she is much too young, very much too young." "But in sunny Italy, you know, we do not count by years." And the signora gave the bishop one of her very sweetest smiles. "But indeed she is a great deal too young," persisted the bishop. "We never confirm before—" "But you might speak to her. You might let her hear from your consecrated lips that she is not a castaway because she is a Roman, that she may be a Nero and yet a Christian, that she may owe her black locks and dark cheeks to the blood of the pagan Caesars, and yet herself be a child of grace. You will tell her this, won't you, my friend?" The friend said he would, and asked if the child could say her catechism. Catechism, even. "No," said the signora. "I would not allow her to learn lessons such as those in a land ridden over by priests and polluted by the idolatry of Rome. It is here in Barchester, that she must first be taught to lisp those holy words. Oh, that you could be her instructor!" Now, Dr. Proudie certainly liked the lady, but seeing that he was a bishop, it was not probable that he was going to instruct a little girl in the first rudiments of her catechism, so he said he'd send a teacher. But you'll see her yourself, my lord? The bishop said he would, but where should he call? At Papa's house, said the signora, with an air of some little surprise at the question. The bishop actually wanted the courage to ask her who was her papa, so he was forced at last to leave her without fathoming the mystery. Mrs. Proudie, in her second best, had now returned to the rooms, and her husband thought it as well that he should not remain in too close conversation with the lady whom his wife appeared to hold in such slight esteem. Presently he came across his youngest daughter. "Netta," said he, "do you know who is the father of that Signora Viceroni?" "It isn't Viceroni, Papa," said Netta, "but Vessi Neroni, and she's Dr. Stanhope's daughter. But I must go and do the civil to Griselda Grantley. I declare nobody has spoken a word to the poor girl this evening." Dr. Stanhope! Dr. Vessi Stanhope, Dr. Vessi Stanhope's daughter, of whose marriage with a dissolute Italian scamp he now remembered to have heard something. And that impertinent blue cub who had examined him as to his episcopal bearings was old Stanhope's son. Episcopal bearings was old Stanhope's son, and the lady who had entreated him to come and teach her child the catechism was old Stanhope's daughter. The daughter of one of his own prebendaries. As these things flashed across his mind, he was nearly as angry as his wife had been. Nevertheless, he could not but own that the mother of the last of the Neros was an agreeable woman. Dr. Proudie tripped out into the adjoining room, in which were congregated a crowd of Grantleyite clergymen, among whom the archdeacon was standing pre-eminent, while the old dean was sitting nearly buried in a huge armchair by the fireplace. The bishop was very anxious to be gracious, and, if possible, to diminish the bitterness which his chaplain had occasioned. Let Mr. Slope do the fortiter in re, he himself would pour in the suaviter in modo. "Pray don't stir, Mr. Dean, pray don't stir," he said, as the old man essayed to get up. "I take it as a great kindness your coming to such an omnium gatherum as this. But we have hardly got settled yet, and Mrs. Proudie has not been able to see her friends as she would wish to do. Well, Mr. Archdeacon, after all, we have not been so hard upon you at Oxford." "No," said the Archdeacon. "You've only drawed our teeth and cut out our tongues. You've allowed us still to breathe and swallow." "Ha, ha, ha," laughed the bishop. "It's not quite so easy to cut out the tongue of an Oxford magnate. And as for teeth, why, in the way we've left the matter, it's very odd if the heads of colleges don't have their own way quite as fully as when the Heptameral Board was all in its glory. What do you say, Mr. Dean?" "An old man, my lord, never likes changes," said the dean. "You must have been sad bunglers if it is so," said the archdeacon. "And indeed, to tell the truth, I think you have bungled it. At any rate, you must own this. You have not done the half what you boasted you would do. Now, as regards your system of professors," began the Chancellor slowly. He was never destined to get beyond such beginning. "Talking of professors," said a soft, clear voice, close behind the Chancellor's elbow, "how much you Englishmen might learn from Germany, only you are all too proud." The bishop, looking round, perceived that abominable young Stanhope had pursued him. The dean stared at him, as though he were some unearthly apparition. Also did 2 or 3 prebendaries and minor canons. The archdeacon laughed. "The German professors are men of learning," said Mr. Harding, "but—" "German professors," groaned out the Chancellor, as though his nervous system had received a shock which nothing but a week of Oxford air could cure. "Yes," continued Ethelbert, not at all understanding why a German professor should be contemptible in the eyes of an Oxford don. Ooh. Pages stuck together. Not but what the name is best earned at Oxford. In Germany the professors do teach. At Oxford I believe they only profess to do so, and sometimes not even that. You'll have those universities of yours about your ears soon if you don't consent to take a lesson from Germany. There was no answering this. Dignified clergymen of 60 years of age could not condescend to discuss such a matter with a young man with such clothes and such a beard. "Have you got good water out at Plumstead, Mr. Archdeacon?" said the bishop by way of changing the conversation. "Pretty good," said Dr. Grantley. "But by no means as good as his wine, my lord," said a witty minor canon. "Nor so generally used," said another. "That is, for inward application." "Ha ha ha," laughed the bishop. "A good cellar of wine is a very comfortable thing in a house." "Your German professors, sir, prefer beer, I believe," said the sarcastic little meagre prebendary. "They don't think much of either," said Ethelbert, "and that perhaps accounts for their superiority. Now the Jewish professor—" The insult was becoming too deep for the spirit of Oxford to endure, so the Archdeacon walked off one way and the Chancellor another, followed by their disciples, and the bishop and the young reformer were left together on the hearthrug. "I was a Jew once myself," began Bertie. The bishop was determined not to stand another examination, or to be led on any terms into Palestine, so he again remembered that he had to do something very particular, and left young Stanhope with the dean. The dean did not get the worst of it, for Ethelbert gave him a true account of his remarkable doings in the Holy Land. "Oh, Mr. Harding," said the bishop, overtaking the ci devant warden. "I wanted to say one word about the hospital. You know, of course, that it is to be filled up." Mr. Harding's heart beat a little, and he said that he had heard so. "Of course," continued the bishop, "there can be only one man whom I could wish to see in that situation. I don't know what your own views may be, Mr. Harding." "They are very simply told, my lord," said the other, "to take the place if it be offered me, and to put up with the want of it should another man get it." The bishop professed himself delighted to hear it. Mr. Harding might be quite sure that no other man would get it. There were some few circumstances which would, in a slight degree, change the nature of the duties. Mr. Harding was probably aware of this, and would perhaps not object to discuss the matter with Mr. Slope. It was a subject to which Mr. Slope had given a good deal of attention. Mr. Harding felt, he knew not why, oppressed and annoyed. What could Mr. Slope do to him? He knew that there were to be changes. The nature of them must be communicated to the warden through somebody, and through whom so naturally as the bishop's chaplain. 'Twas thus he tried to argue himself back to an easy mind, but in vain. Mr. Slope, in the meantime, had taken the seat which the bishop had vacated on the signora's sofa, and remained with that lady till it was time to marshal the folk to supper. Not with contented eyes had Mrs. Proudie seen this. Had not this woman laughed at her distress, and had not Mr. Slope heard it? Was she not an intriguing Italian woman, half wife and half not, full of affectation, airs, and impudence? Was she not horribly bedizened with velvet and pearls, too, which had not been torn off her back? Above all, did she not pretend to be more beautiful than her neighbours? To say that Mrs. Proudie was jealous would not give a wrong idea of her feelings. She had not the slightest desire that Mr. Slope should be in love with herself, but she desired the incense of Mr. Slope's spiritual and temporal services, and did not choose that they should be turned out of their course to such an object as Signora Neroni. She considered also that Mr. Slope ought in duty to hate the signora, and it appeared from his manner that he was very far from hating her. "Come, Mr. Slope," she said, sweeping by and looking all that she felt. "Can't you make yourself useful? Do pray take Mrs. Grantley down to supper." Mrs. Grantley heard and escaped. The words were hardly out of Mrs. Proudie's mouth before the intended victim had stuck her hand through the arm of one of her husband's curates and saved herself. What would the Archdeacon have said had he seen her walking downstairs with Mr. Slope? Mr. Slope heard also, but was by no means so obedient as was expected. Indeed, the period of Mr. Slope's obedience to Mrs. Proudie was drawing to a close. He did not wish yet to break with her, nor to break with her at all if it could be avoided, but he intended to be master in that palace, and as she had made the same resolution, it was not improbable that they might come to blows. Before leaving the signora, he arranged a little table before her, and begged to know what he should bring her. She was quite indifferent, and she said, "Nothing, anything." It was now she felt the misery of her position, now that she must be left alone. "Well, a little chicken, some ham and a glass of champagne." Mr. Slope had to explain, not without blushing for his patron, that there was no champagne. Sherry would do just as well. And then Mr. Slope descended with the learned Miss Trefoil on his arm. Could she tell him, he asked, whether the ferns of Barsetshire were equal to those of Cumberland? His strongest worldly passion was for ferns, and before she could answer him he left her wedged between the door and the sideboard. It was 50 minutes before she escaped, and even then unfed. "You are not leaving us, Mr. Slope?" said the watchful lady of the house, seeing her slave escaping towards the door, with stores of provisions held high above the heads of the guests. Mr. Slope explained that the Signora Neroni was in want of her supper. "Pray, Mr. Slope, let her brother take it out to her," said Mrs. Proudie, quite out loud. "It is out of the question that you should be so employed. Pray, Mr. Slope, oblige me. I am sure Mr. Stanhope will wait upon his sister." Ethelbert was most agreeably occupied in the farthest corner of the room, making himself both useful and agreeable to Mrs. Proudie's youngest daughter. "I couldn't get out, madam, if Madeline was starving for her supper," said he. "I'm physically fixed unless I could fly." The lady's anger was increased by seeing that her daughter had also had gone over to the enemy, and when she saw that, in spite of her remonstrances, in the teeth of her positive orders, Mr. Slope went off to the drawing-room, the cup of her indignation ran over, and she could not restrain herself. "Such manners I never saw," she said, muttering. "I cannot and I will not permit it." And then, after fussing and fuming for a few minutes, she pushed her way through the crowd and followed Mr. Slope. When she reached the room above, she found it absolutely deserted, except by the guilty pair. The signora was sitting very comfortably up to her supper, and Mr. Slope was leaning over her and administering to her wants. They had been discussing the merits of Sabbath-day schools, and the lady had suggested that, as she could not possibly go to the children, she might be indulged in the wish of her heart by having the children brought to her. "And when shall it be, Mr. Slope?" said she. Mr. Slope was saved the necessity of committing himself to a promise by the entry of Mrs. Proudie. She swept close up to the sofa so as to confront the guilty pair, stared full at them for a moment, and then said as she passed on to the next room, "Mr. Slope, his lordship is especially desirous of your attendance below. You will greatly oblige me if you will join him." And so she stalked on. Mr. Slope muttered something in reply and prepared to go downstairs. As for the bishop's wanting him, he knew his lady patroness well enough to take that assertion at what it was worth, but he did not wish to make himself the hero of a scene, or to become conspicuous for more gallantry than the occasion required. "Is she always like this?" said the Signora. "Yes, always, madam," said Mrs. Proudie, returning. "Always the same, always equally adverse to impropriety of conduct of every description." And she stalked back through the room again, following Mr. Slope out of the door. The Signora couldn't follow her, or she certainly would have done so, but she laughed loud, and sent the sound of it ringing through the lobby and down the stairs after Mrs. Proudie's feet. Had she been as active as Grimaldi, she could probably have taken no better revenge. "Mr. Slope," said Mrs. Proudie, catching the delinquent at the door, "I am surprised that you should leave my company to attend on such a painted Jezebel as that." "But she's lame, Mrs. Proudie, and cannot move. Somebody must have waited upon her." "Lame?" said Mrs. Proudie. "I'd lame her if she belonged to me. What business has she here at all? Such impertinence, such affectation!" In the hall and adjacent rooms all manner of cloaking and shawling was going on, and the Barchester folk were getting themselves gone. Mrs. Proudie did her best to smirk at each and every one as they made their adieu, but she was hardly successful. Her temper had been tried fearfully. By slow degrees the guests went. "Send back the carriage quick," said Ethelbert, as Dr. and Mrs. Stanhope took their departure. The younger Stanhopes were left to the very last, and an uncomfortable party they made with the bishop's family. They all went into the dining-room, and then the bishop, observing that the lady was alone in the drawing-room, they followed him up. Mrs. Proudie kept Mr. Slope and her daughters in close conversation, resolving that he should not be indulged, nor they polluted. The bishop, in mortal dread of Bertie, tried to converse with Charlotte Stanhope about the climate of Italy. Bertie and the Signora had no resource but in each other. "Did you get your supper at last, Madeline?" said the impudent or else mischievous young man. "Oh, yes," said Madeline. "Mr. Slope was so very kind as to bring it to me. I fear, however, he put himself to more inconvenience than I wished." Mrs. Proudie looked at her, but said nothing. The meaning of her look might have been thus translated. Excuse me. The meaning of her look might have been thus translated: "If ever you find yourself within these walls again, I'll give you leave to be as impudent and affected and as mischievous as you please." At last the carriage returned with the other 3 Italian servants, and La Signora Madeline Vesineroni was carried out, as she had been carried in. The lady of the palace retired to her chamber, by no means contented with the result of her first grand party at Barchester. And I think there we shall stop and take a break. This is very entertaining. I hope you are enjoying it as much as I am. This is great fun. So much social politics. Ah, joys. Anyway, yes, we shall take a break, so go do break-related things, and we will be back in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. And we return. Hello everybody, welcome back. I hope we have had a good break and done break-related things. Got drinks, stretched, all of the stuff. But I have not moved. Yeah. Just punch the mic, let's not do that again. But yes, I'll see how much longer I go for, just because, as you can probably tell, voice is getting a bit... So, and I'm sure you don't want ASMR croaking. But, yeah, I hope you are enjoying so far. I am loving this. This is properly just church gossip at this point, isn't it? It is right up there with, you know... It does feel kind of like a cross between Dickens and Jane Austen in that sense, just because Jane Austen, you know, wrote about sort of, I don't know, sort of interpersonal relationships and like polite society, but people being catty and just kind of gossip a little bit. And then Dickens was just like, let's chuck some just completely ridiculous characters in here and make them all caricatures. And so I feel like this is a bit of both. Which I quite like. Yeah, I am very much enjoying these characters. Oh, excuse me. And their various problems and insecurities. Bless them. But yeah. I hope we are all enjoying. I hope those of you who are, you know, attempting to multi-stream are managing. It's hard to keep track of things, but it's fun to just kind of tag along with the story. Yeah, especially I guess if you've got another stream on at the same time, it's going to be kind of impossible. But yeah, it's just you know, just people being badly behaved and all of that. My desk is creaking. You don't even have the other streams on, you're just puzzling. Oh, that's fair enough. That is fair. I hope the puzzling is going well. I hope you are being puzzled. No, I don't hope that you are being puzzled. I hope that you are puzzling the puzzle. I don't know where I'm going with that. Words. But yes, yeah, I'll see how much more I get through. But if we are all back and sitting comfortably and stuff, we shall continue. Oh, your friend Trevor has joined you. Excellent. We shall continue with Chapter 12. Slope versus Harding. 2 or 3 days after the party, Mr. Harding received a note begging him to call on Mr. Slope at the palace at an early hour the following morning. There was nothing uncivil in the communication, and yet the tone of it was thoroughly displeasing. It was as follows. My dear Mr. Harding, will you favour me by calling on me at the palace tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m? The bishop wishes me to speak to you touching the hospital. I hope you will excuse my naming so early an hour. I do so as my time is greatly occupied. If, however, it is positively inconvenient to you, I will change it to 10. You will, perhaps, be kind enough to let me have a note in reply. Believe me to be, my dear Mr. Harding, your assured friend, Obadiah Slope. The Palace, Monday morning, 20th of August, 1850. Mr. Harding neither could nor would believe anything of the sort, and he thought, moreover, that Mr. Slope was rather impertinent to call himself by such a name. His assured friend, indeed? How many assured friends generally fall to the lot of a man in this world, and by what process are they made? And how much of such process had taken place as yet between Mr. Harding and Mr. Slope? Mr. Harding could not help asking himself these questions as he read and reread the note before him. He answered it, however, as follows. Dear Sir, I will call at the palace tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. as you desire. Truly yours, S. Harding. High Street, Barchester, Monday. And on the following morning, punctually at 9:30, he knocked at the palace door and asked for Mr. Slope. The bishop had one small room allotted to him on the ground floor, and Mr. Slope had another. Into this latter Mr. Harding was shown and asked to sit down. Mr. Slope was not yet there. The ex-warden stood up at the window looking into the garden, and could not help thinking how very short a time had passed since the whole of that house had been open to him, as though he had been a child of the family, born and bred in it. He remembered how the old servants used to smile as they opened the door to him, how the familiar butler would say, when he had been absent a few hours longer than usual, "A sight of you, Mr. Harding, is good for sore eyes." How the fussy housekeeper would swear that he couldn't have dined, or couldn't have breakfasted, or couldn't have lunched. And then, above all, he remembered the pleasant gleam of inward satisfaction which always spread itself over the old bishop's face whenever his friend entered the room. A tear came into each eye as he reflected that all this was gone. What use would the hospital be to him now? He was alone in the world, and getting old. He would soon, very soon, have to go, and leave it all, as his dear old friend had gone. Go and leave the hospital, and his accustomed place in the cathedral, and his haunts and pleasures, to younger and perhaps wiser men. That chanting of his, perhaps, in truth, the time for it had gone by. He felt as though the world was sinking from his feet, as though this was the time for him to turn with confidence to those hopes which he had preached with confidence to others. What, said he to himself, can a man's religion be worth if it does not support him against the natural melancholy of declining years? And, as he looked out through his dimmed eyes into the bright parterres of the bishop's garden, he felt that he had the support which he wanted. Nevertheless, he did not like to be thus kept waiting. If Mr. Slope did not really wish to see him at 9:30, why force him to come away from his lodgings with his breakfast in his throat? To tell the truth, it was policy on the part of Mr. Slope. Mr. Slope had made up his mind that Mr. Harding should either accept the hospital with abject submission or else refuse it altogether, and had calculated that he would probably be more quick to do the latter if he could be got to enter upon the subject in an ill humour. Perhaps Mr. Slope was not altogether wrong in his calculation. It was nearly 10 when Mr. Slope hurried into the room, and, muttering something about the bishop and diocesan duties, shook Mr. Harding's hand ruthlessly and begged him to be seated. Now, the air of superiority which this man assumed did go against the grain of Mr. Harding, and yet he did not know how to resent it. The whole tendency of his mind and disposition was opposed to any contra-assumption of grandeur on his own part, and he hadn't the worldly spirit of quickness necessary to put down insolent pretensions by downright and open rebuke, as the Archdeacon would have done. There was nothing for Mr. Harding but to submit, and he accordingly did so. "About the hospital, Mr. Harding," began Mr. Slope, speaking of it as the head of a college at Cambridge might speak of some sizarship which had to be disposed of. Mr. Harding crossed one leg over another, and then one hand over the other on the top of them, and looked Mr. Slope in the face, but he said nothing. "It's to be filled up again," said Mr. Slope. Mr. Harding said that he had understood so. "Of course, you know the income will be very much reduced," continued Mr. Slope. "The bishop wished to be liberal, and he therefore told the government that he thought it ought to be put at not less than £450. I think on the whole the bishop was right, for though the services required will be not be of a very onerous nature, they will be more so than they were before. and it is perhaps well that the clergy immediately attached to the cathedral town should be made as comfortable as the extent of the ecclesiastical means at our disposal will allow. Those are the bishop's ideas, and I must say mine also." Mr. Harding sat rubbing one hand on the other, but said not a word. "So much for the income, Mr. Harding. The house will of course remain to the warden, as before. It should, however, I think, be stipulated that he should paint inside every 7 years and outside every 3 years, and be subject to dilapidations in the event of vacating, either by death or otherwise. But this is a matter on which the bishop must yet be consulted." Mr. Harding still rubbed his hands, and still sat silent, gazing up into Mr. Slope's unprepossessing face. "Then as to the duties," continued he, "I believe, if I am rightly informed, there can hardly be said to have been any duties hitherto." And he gave a sort of half laugh, as though to pass off the accusation in the guise of a pleasantry. Mr. Harding thought of the happy, easy years he had passed in his old home, of the worn-out, aged men whom he had succoured, of his good intentions, and of his work, which had certainly been of the lightest. He thought of these things, doubting for a moment whether he did or did not deserve the sarcasm. He gave his enemy the benefit of the doubt, and did not rebuke him. He merely observed very tranquilly, and perhaps with too much humility, that the duties of the situation, such as they were, had, he believed, been done to the satisfaction of the late bishop. Mr. Slope again smiled, and this time the smile was intended to operate against the memory of the late bishop rather than against the energy of the ex-warden, and so it was understood by Mr. Harding. The colour rose to his cheeks, and he began to feel very angry. "You must be aware, Mr. Harding, that things are a good deal changed in Barchester," said Mr. Slope. Mr. Harding said that he was aware of it. "And not only in Barchester, Mr. Harding, but in the world at large. It is not only in Barchester that a new man is carrying out new measures and casting away the useless rubbish of past centuries. The same thing is going on throughout the country. Work is now required from every man who receives wages, and they who have to superintend the doing of work and the paying of wages are bound to see that this rule is carried out. New men, Mr. Harding, are now needed, and are now forthcoming in the church, as well as in other professions." All this was wormwood to our old friend. He had never rated very high his own abilities or activity, but all the feelings of his heart were with the old clergy, and any antipathies of which his heart was susceptible were directed against those new, busy, uncharitable, self-lauding men of whom Mr. Slope was so good an example. "Perhaps," said he, "the bishop will prefer a new man at the hospital." "By no means," said Mr. Slope. "The bishop is very anxious that you should accept the appointment, but he wishes that you should understand beforehand what will be the required duties. In the first place, a Sabbath day school will be attached to the hospital." "What, for the old men?" asked Mr. Harding. "No, Mr. Harding, not for the old men, but for the benefit of the children of such of the poor of Barchester as it may suit. The bishop will expect that you shall attend this school, and that the teachers shall be under your inspection and care." Mr. Harding slipped his topmost hand off the other, and began to rub the calf of the leg which was supported. "As to the old men," continued Mr. Slope, "and the old women who are to form a part of the hospital, the bishop is desirous that you shall have morning and evening service on the premises every Sabbath, and one weekday service, that you shall preach to them once at least on Sundays, and that the whole hospital be always collected for morning and evening prayer. The bishop thinks that this will render it unnecessary that any separate seats in the cathedral should be reserved for the hospital inmates." Mr. Slope paused, but Mr. Harding still said nothing. Indeed, it would be difficult to find seats for the women, and, on the whole, Mr. Harding, I may as well say at once that for people of that class the cathedral service does not appear to me the most useful, even if it be so for any class of people. "We will not discuss that, if you please," said Mr. Harding. "I am not desirous of doing so, at least not at the present moment. I hope, however, you fully understand the Bishop's wishes about the new establishment of the hospital, and if, as I do not doubt, I shall receive from you an assurance that you accord with his lordship's views, it will give me very great pleasure to be the bearer from his lordship to you of the presentation to the appointment." "But if I disagree with his lordship's views?" asked Mr. Harding. "But I hope you do not." "But if I do?" again asked the other. "If such unfortunately should be the case, which I can hardly conceive, I presume your own feelings will dictate to you the propriety of declining the appointment." "But if I accept the appointment and yet disagree with the bishop, what then?" This question rather bothered Mr. Slope. It was true that he had talked the matter over with the bishop, and had received a sort of authority for suggesting to Mr. Harding the propriety of a Sunday school and certain hospital services, but he had no authority for saying that these propositions were to be made peremptory conditions attached to the appointment. The bishop's idea had been that Mr. Harding would of course consent, and that the school would become, like the rest of those new establishments in the city, under the control of his wife and his chaplain. Mr. Slope's idea had been more correct. He intended that Mr. Harding should refuse the situation, and that an ally of his own should get it, but he had not conceived the possibility of Mr. Harding openly accepting the appointment and as openly rejecting the conditions. "It is not, I presume, probable," said he, "that you will accept from the hands of the bishop a piece of preferment with the fixed predetermination to disacknowledge the duties attached to it." "If I become warden," said Mr. Harding, "and neglect my duty, the bishop has means by which he can remedy the grievance." "I hardly expected such an argument from you, or I may say the suggestion of such a line of conduct," said Mr. Slope, with a great look of injured virtue. "Nor did I expect such a proposition." "I shall be glad at any rate to know what answer I am to make to his lordship," said Mr. Slope. "I will take an early opportunity of seeing his lordship myself," said Mr. Harding. "Such an arrangement," said Mr. Slope, "will hardly give his lordship satisfaction. Indeed, it is impossible that the bishop should himself see every clergyman in the diocese on every subject of patronage that may arise. The bishop, I believe, did see you on the matter, and I really cannot see why he should be troubled to do so again." "Do you know, Mr. Slope, how long I have been officiating as a clergyman in this city?" Mr. Slope's wish was very nearly fulfilled. Mr. Harding had become angry, and it was probable that he might commit himself. "I really do not see what that has to do with the question. You cannot think the bishop would be justified in allowing you to regard as a sinecure a situation that requires an active man merely because you have been employed for many years in the cathedral." "But it might induce the bishop to see me if I asked him to do so." "I shall consult my friends in this matter, Mr. Slope, but I mean to be guilty of no subterfuge. You may tell the bishop that as I altogether disagree with his views about the hospital, I shall decline the situation if I find that any such conditions are attached to it as those you have suggested." And so saying, Mr. Harding took his hat and went his way. Mr. Slope was contented. He considered himself at liberty to accept Mr. Harding's last speech as an absolute refusal of the appointment. At least, he so represented it to the bishop and to Mrs. Proudie. That is very surprising," said the bishop. "Not at all," said Mrs. Proudie. "You little know how determined the whole set of them are to withstand your authority." "But Mr. Harding was so anxious for it," said the bishop. "Yes," said Mr. Slope, "if he can hold it without the slightest acknowledgment of your lordship's jurisdiction." "That is out of the question," said the bishop. "I should imagine it to be quite so," said the chaplain. "Indeed, I should think so," said the lady. "I really am sorry for it," said the bishop. "I don't know that there is much cause for sorrow," said the lady. "Mr. Quiverful is a much more deserving man, more in need of it, and one who will make himself much more useful in the close neighbourhood of the palace." "I suppose I had better see Quiverful?" said the chaplain. "I suppose you had," said the bishop. Chapter 13. The Rubbish Cart. Mr. Harding was not a happy man as he walked down the palace pathway and stepped out into the close. His preferment and pleasant house were a second time gone from him, but that he could endure. He had been schooled and insulted by a man young enough to be his son, but that he could put up with. He could even draw from the very injuries which had been inflicted on him some of that consolation which, we may believe, martyrs always receive from the injustice of their own sufferings, and which is generally proportioned in its strength to the extent of cruelty with which martyrs are treated. He had admitted to his daughter that he wanted the comfort of his old home, and yet he could have returned to his lodgings in the High Street, if not with exultation, at least with satisfaction, had that been all. But the venom of the chaplain's harangue— I've never actually heard that word pronounced out loud, there we go, harangue, I think, had worked into his blood and sapped the life of his sweet contentment. Haranguing. It's haranguing. New men are carrying out new measures, and are carting away the useless rubbish of past centuries. What cruel words these had been, and how often are they now used with all the heartless cruelty of a Slope. A man is sufficiently condemned if it can only be shown that, either in politics or religion, he does not belong to some new school established within the last score of years. He may then regard himself as rubbish and expect to be carted away. A man is nothing now unless he has within him a full appreciation of the new era, an era in which it would seem that neither honesty nor truth is very desirable, but in which success is the only touchstone of merit. We must laugh at everything that is established. Let the joke be ever so bad, ever so untrue to the real principles of joking, nevertheless we must laugh, or else beware the cart. We must talk, think, and live up to the spirit of the times, and right up to it too, if that cacoeths be upon us, or else we are naught. New men and new measures, long credit and few scruples, great success or wonderful ruin. Such are now the tastes of Englishmen who know how to live. Alas, alas! Under such circumstances, Mr. Harding could not but feel that he was an Englishman who did not know how to live. This new doctrine of Mr. Slope and the rubbish cart, new at least at Barchester, sadly disturbed his equanimity. The same thing is going on throughout the whole country. Work is now required from every man who receives wages. And had he been living all his life receiving wages and doing no work? Had he in truth so lived as to be now in his old age justly reckoned as rubbish, fit only to be hidden away in some huge dust-hole? The school of men to whom he professes to belong, the Grantleys, the Gwynns, and the old high set of Oxford divines, are afflicted with no such self-accusations as these which troubled Mr. Harding. They, as a rule, are as satisfied with the wisdom and propriety of their own conduct as can be any Mr. Slope or any Dr. Proudie with his own. But, unfortunately for himself, Mr. Harding had little of this self-reliance. When he heard himself designated as rubbish by the Slopes of the world, he had no other resource than to make inquiry within his own bosom as to the truth of the designation. Alas, alas, the evidence seemed generally to go against him. He had professed to himself in the bishop's parlour that in these coming sources of the sorrow of age, in these fits of sad regret from which the latter years of few reflecting men can be free, religion would suffice to comfort him. Yes, religion could console him for the loss of any worldly good. But was his religion of that active sort which would enable him so to repent of misspent years as to pass those that were left to him in a spirit of hope for the future? And such repentance itself, is it not a work of agony and of tears? It is very easy to talk of repentance, but a man has to walk over hot ploughshares before he can complete it to be skinned alive as was St. Bartholomew, to be stuck full of arrows as was St. Sebastian, to lie broiling on a gridiron like St. Lorenzo. How, if his past life required such repentance as this, had he the energy to go through with it? Mr. Harding, after leaving the palace, walked slowly for an hour or so beneath the shady elms of the close, and then betook himself to his daughter's house. He had, at any rate, made up his mind that he would go out to Plumstead to consult Dr. Grantley, and that he would, in the first instance, tell Eleanor what had occurred. And now he was doomed to undergo another misery. Mr. Slope had forestalled him at the widow's house. He had called there on the preceding afternoon. He could not, he had said, deny himself the pleasure of telling Mrs. Bold that her father was about to return to the pretty house at Hiram's Hospital. He had been instructed by the bishop to inform Mr. Harding that the appointment would now be made at once. The bishop was, of course, only too happy to be able to be the means of restoring to Mr. Harding the preferment which he had so long adorned. And then, by degrees, Mr. Slope had introduced the subject of the pretty school which he hoped before long to see attached to the hospital. He had quite fascinated Mrs. Bold by his description of this picturesque, useful, and charitable appendage, and she had gone so far as to say that she had no doubt her father would approve, and that she herself would gladly undertake a class. Anyone who had heard the entirely different tone and seen the entirely different manner in which Mr. Slope had spoken of this projected institution to the daughter and to the father could not have failed to own that Mr. Slope was a man of genius. He said nothing to Mrs. Bold about the hospital's sermons and services, nothing about the exclusion of the old men from the cathedral, nothing about dilapidation and painting, nothing about carting away the rubbish. Eleanor had said to herself that certainly she did not like Mr. Slope personally, but that he was a very active, zealous clergyman, and would no doubt be useful in Barchester. All this paved the way for much additional misery to Mr. Harding. Eleanor put on her happiest face as she heard her father on the stairs, for she thought she had only to congratulate him. But directly she saw his face, she knew that there was but little matter for congratulation. She had seen him with the same weary look of sorrow on 1 or 2 occasions before, and remembered it well. She had seen him when he first read that attack upon himself in The Jupiter, which had ultimately caused him to resign the hospital, and she had seen him also when the Archdeacon had persuaded him to remain there against his own sense of propriety and honour. She knew at a glance that his spirit was in deep trouble. "Oh, Papa, what is it?" said she, putting down her boy to crawl upon the floor. "I came to tell you, my dear," said he, "that I'm going out to Plumstead. You won't come with me, I suppose?" "To Plumstead, Papa? Shall you stay there?" "I suppose I shall tonight. I must consult the Archdeacon about this weary hospital. Ah, me, I wish I had never thought of it again." "Why, Papa? What is the matter?" "I've been with Mr. Slope, my dear, and he isn't the pleasantest companion in the world, at least not to me." Eleanor gave a sort of half-blush, but she was wrong if she imagined that her father in any way alluded to her acquaintance with Mr. Slope. "Well, Papa?" "He wants to turn the hospital into a Sunday school and a preaching house, and I suppose he will have his way. I do not feel myself adapted for such an establishment, and therefore I suppose I must refuse the appointment." "What would be the harm of the school, Papa?" "The want of a proper schoolmaster, my dear." "But that would of course be supplied." "Mr. Slope wishes to supply it by making me his schoolmaster, but as I am hardly fit for such work, I intend to decline." "Oh, Papa, Mr. Slope doesn't intend that. He was here yesterday, and what he intends—" "He was here yesterday, was he?" asked Mr. Harding. "Yes, Papa." "And talking about the hospital?" "He was saying how glad he would be, and the bishop too, to see you back there again. And then he spoke about the Sunday school, and to tell the truth I agreed with him, and I thought you would have done so too. Mr. Slope spoke of a school, not inside the hospital, but just connected with it, of which you would be the patron and visitor, and I thought you would have liked such a school as that. And I promised to look after it and to take a class, and it all seems so very... But, oh, Papa, I shall be so miserable if I find I have done wrong." "Nothing wrong at all, my dear," said he gently, very gently rejecting his daughter's caress. "There can be nothing wrong in your wishing to make yourself useful. Indeed, you ought to do so by all means. Everyone must now exert himself who would not choose to go to the wall." Poor Mr. Harding thus attempted in his misery to preach the new doctrine to his child. "Himself or herself, it's all the same," he continued. "You will be quite right, my dear, to do something of this sort, but—" "Well, Papa?" "I am not quite sure that if I were you I would select Mr. Slope for my guide." "But I never have done so, and never shall." "It would be very wicked of me to speak evil of him, for, to tell the truth, I know no evil of him, but I am not quite sure that he is honest. That he is not gentlemanlike in his manners, of that I am quite sure." "I never thought of taking him for my guide, Papa." "As for myself, my dear," continued he, we know the old proverb. It's bad teaching an old dog tricks. I must decline the Sunday school, and shall therefore probably decline the hospital also. But I will first see your brother-in-law." So he took up his hat, kissed the baby, and withdrew, leaving Eleanor in as low spirits as himself. All this was a great aggravation to his misery. He had so few with whom to sympathise that he could not afford to be cut off from the one whose sympathy was of the most value to him, and yet it seemed probable that this would be the case. He did not own to himself that he wished his daughter to hate Mr. Slope, yet she had expressed such a feeling there would have been very little bitterness in the rebuke he would have given her for so uncharitable a state of mind. Excuse me. The fact, however, was that she was on friendly terms with Mr. Slope, that she coincided with his views, adhered at once to his plans, and listened with delight to his teaching. Mr. Harding hardly wished his daughter to hate the man, but he would have preferred that to her loving him. He walked away to the inn to order a fly, went home to put up his carpet-bag, and then started for Plumstead. There was, at any rate, no danger that the Archdeacon would fraternise with Mr. Slope. But then he would recommend internecine war, public appeals, loud reproaches, and all the paraphernalia of open battle. Now that alternative was hardly more to Mr. Harding's taste than the other. When Mr. Harding reached the parsonage, he found that the Archdeacon was out, and would not be home till dinner-time, so he began his complaint to his elder daughter. Mrs. Grantley entertained quite as strong an antagonism to Mr. Slope as did her husband. She was also quite as alive to the necessity of combating the Proudie faction, of supporting the old church interest of the Close, of keeping in her own set such of the loaves and fishes as duly belonged to it, and was quite as well prepared as her lord to carry on the battle without giving or taking quarter. Not that she was a woman prone to quarrelling, or ill-inclined to live at peace with her clerical neighbours, but she felt, as did the Archdeacon, that the presence of Mr. Slope in Barchester was an insult to everyone connected with the late bishop, and that his assumed dominion in the diocese was a spiritual injury to her husband. Hitherto people had little guessed how bitter Mrs. Grantley could be. She lived on the best of terms with all the rectors' wives around her. She had been popular with all the ladies connected with the Close. Though much the wealthiest of the ecclesiastical matrons of the county, she had so managed her affairs that her carriage and horses had given umbrage to none. She had never thrown herself among the country grandees as to excite the envy of other clergymen's wives. She had never talked too loudly of earls and countesses, or boasted that she gave her governess £60 a year, or her cook 70. Mrs. Grantley had lived the life of a wise, discreet, peacemaking woman, and the people of Barchester were surprised at the amount of military vigour she displayed as general of the feminine Grantleyite forces. Mrs. Grantley soon learned that her sister Eleanor had promised to assist Mr. Slope in the affairs of the hospital, and it was on this point that her attention soon fixed itself. "How can Eleanor endure him?" said she. "He is a very crafty man," said her father, "and his craft has been successful in making Eleanor think that he is a meek, charitable, good clergyman. God forgive me if I wrong him, but such is not his true character, in my opinion." "His true character, indeed," said she, with something approaching to scorn for her father's moderation. "I only hope he won't have craft enough to make Eleanor forget herself and her position." "Do you mean marry him?" said he, startled out of his usual demeanour by the abruptness and horror of so dreadful a proposition. "What is there so improbable in it? Of course that would be his own object if he thought he had any chance of success. Eleanor has 1,000 a year entirely at her own disposal, and what better fortune could fall to Mr. Slope's lot than the transferring of that disposal of such a fortune to himself?" "But you can't think she likes him, Susan?" "Why not?" said Susan. "Why shouldn't she like him? He's just the sort of man to get on with a woman left as she is, with no one to look after her." "Look after her?" said the unhappy father. "Don't we look after her?" "Ah, papa, how innocent you are. Of course it was to be expected that Eleanor should marry again. I should be the last to advise her against it, if she would only wait the proper time, and then marry at least a gentleman." "But you don't really mean to say that you suppose Eleanor has ever thought of marrying Mr. Slope? Why, Mr. Bold has only been dead a year," 18 months, said his daughter. But I don't suppose Eleanor has ever thought about it. It is very probable, though, that he has, and that he will try and make her do so, and that he will succeed, too, if we don't take care what we are about. This was quite a new phase of the affair to poor Mr. Harding. To have thrust upon him as his son-in-law, as the husband of his favourite child, the only man in the world whom he really positively disliked, would be a misfortune which he felt he would not know how to endure patiently. But then, could there be any ground for so dreadful a surmise? In all worldly matters he was apt to look upon the opinion of his eldest daughter as one generally sound and trustworthy. In her appreciation of character, of motives, and the probable conduct both of men and women, she was usually not far wrong. She had early foreseen the marriage of Eleanor and John Bold. She had at a glance deciphered the character of the new bishop and his chaplain. Could it possibly be that her present surmise should ever come forth as true? "But you don't think that she likes him?" said Mr. Harding again. "Well, Papa, I can't say that I think she dislikes him as she ought to. Why is he visiting there as a confidential friend when he never ought to have been admitted inside the house? Why is it that she speaks to him about your welfare and your position, as she clearly has done? At the bishop's party the other night I saw her talking to him for half an hour at the stretch." "I thought Mr. Slope seemed to talk to nobody there but that daughter of Stanhope's," said Mr. Harding, wishing to defend his child. "Oh, Mr. Slope is a cleverer man than you think of, Papa, and keeps more than one iron in the fire." To give Eleanor her due, any suspicion as to that slightest inclination on her part towards Mr. Slope was a wrong to her. She had no more idea of marrying Mr. Slope than she had of marrying the bishop, and the idea that Mr. Slope would present himself as a suitor never occurred to her. Indeed, to give her her due again, she had never thought about suitors since her husband's death. But nevertheless, it was true that she had overcome all that repugnance to the man which was so strongly felt for him by the rest of the Grantley faction. She had forgiven him his sermon. She had forgiven him his low church tendencies, his Sabbath schools and puritanical observances. She had forgiven his pharisaical arrogance, and even his greasy face and oily vulgar manners. Having agreed to overlook such offences as these, why should she not in time be taught to regard Mr. Slope as a suitor? And as to him, it must also be affirmed that he was hitherto equally innocent of the crime imputed to him. How it had come to pass that a man whose eyes were generally so widely open to everything around him had not perceived that this young widow was rich as well as beautiful, cannot probably now be explained. But such was the fact. Mr. Slope had ingratiated himself with Mrs. Bold merely as he had done with other ladies, in order to strengthen his party in the city. He subsequently amended his error, but it was not till after the interview between him and Mr. Harding. And I think there we shall finish for tonight. Thank you for listening. Yes, my voice is feeling a little sore, so I think we shall wrap that up a little early. But yes, hope you're enjoying. Thank you very much indeed for the raid from, Longest Dave and Longest Johns. Thank you very much, Sam and Dave. I hope the farming went well, and that you didn't break the game. And thank you very much, Ray Tracer, for 35 months. My goodness me, it's a very long time. Yeah, this is getting very, very gossipy and very dramatic. I'm quite enjoying it. Let us see. You'll have to go back and listen to the bits you missed. Oh, the beginning was fun. The beginning was a lot of fun. We'll strongly recommend you go back and listen to the beginning because, yeah, it was fun. Yeah, let's see. Is there anyone to raid?
Who's on? Oh, we could raid over to Billiam. Or we could raid... Ooh, we've got several things. Sam, do you have a choice? We've got Billiam, we've got Blue Skittle, we've got Lure. Up to you. Sam can choose. If he's still here. Which he may not be. That's a helpful response. But yeah, in theory, Sam will be back on Saturday with some short stories of some description. You were just restarting your browser. Oh. We have options of raids. Blue Skittle, Billiam, Lure. Skittle? Yeah. Let's head on over to Skittle. Right. So. We will throw you all over to the wonderful Blue Skittle, who is painting environments. Ooh, lovely. Very nice. Oh, you're just doing the raid for me. Great. Fab. But yes. Thank you all very much for being here. Go take care of yourselves. We shall hopefully see you back on Saturday. And also Monday for Wiki Racing. But yeah, thank you all very much for being here. And we shall see you all soon. Thank you and goodbye.